Well, it is my pleasure to welcome you all back this evening and to introduce our keynote speaker that you are here for his presentation, Dr. Mark Stewart. We're fortunate to have him with us tonight because he stands in a special place in the world of environmental historians as the author of a book that transformed the way we look at the history of coastal Georgia and provided an important link to the history of the American South. Mark Stewart grew up in the mountains of eastern Oregon, a fifth-generation descendant of those early pioneers who made their way through the Pacific Northwest and who stopped their wagons before reaching the coast, preferring to carve out a place for themselves in the timber-rich part of that state. Thanks to that heritage, he knows the woods. As a young man, he had a 10-season stint working as a forester in those mountains. He received his BA from Willamette and his MA from Portland State University, and then made his way across the country here to Emory University for a PhD. There he earned a reputation as someone who wanted to do a different kind of history. He's taught at Western Washington University since 1992. Over the last 2 decades, Mark Stewart's scholarship has not only been essential to defining the field of Southern environmental history, but also in bringing the study of the South into the environmental history mainstream. He has published a series of highly influential articles and book chapters on Southern environmental history, including on such essential topics as kudzu and cane brakes, cattle herding and rice culture, African American environmental knowledge, and the place of weather in Southern conceptions of environmental distinctiveness. He is the author, of course, of the pioneering book, What Nature Suffers to Grow, Life, Labor, and Landscape on the Georgia Coast, 1680 to 1920, published by the University of Georgia Press in 1996. It remains the definitive environmental history of Georgia coast and one of the most important environmental histories we have of the rise and fall of an American agricultural landscape. While it is bookended with superb discussions of the evolution of the early colonial Georgia landscape and the rise of 20th century landscapes of leisure and conservation along the coast, the heart of his book is an innovative analysis of the growth and development of tidal flow rice culture as a hydraulic system built upon the capture and control of various forms of energy, including the labor of African slaves. It is a book that laid the groundwork for reclaiming the environmental history of slavery and plantation agriculture from an older historiography of environmental determinism. It remains essential reading for anyone interested in the environmental history of the Georgia coast. Mark Stewart's address tonight represents a special moment as he sets the table for the grand themes that this symposium seeks to address. His title, Islands, Edges, Globe, speaks to his goal of giving the history of the Georgia coast a nudge in the global direction. Please give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Stewart.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Really nice introduction. Thank you. Usually, I'm a country boy, and I grew up working in the woods and in the fields, and so I usually take my coat off and roll up my sleeves when I start to talk, but I have all this paraphernalia, microphones, and I'm wired up with all kinds of things, so I have to be more formal here than I usually am. I'm really delighted to be back in Savannah again. Can't tell you how happy I am. Thanks so much to all of you for coming tonight. And thanks to Stan's wonderful introduction, to Paul for inviting me, to the Ossabaw Foundation and all the people you named earlier for organizing this wonderful conference. It's been a while since I've been in Savannah. The last time I think was 2009 at the Wormslow Institute for Environmental History, where I gave a talk that I'll build on tonight. But I remember an early conference about 20 years ago. I think we called it landscape history then rather than environmental history, that was organized by Armstrong College when I had a chance first to meet Mark Finley, who I concur that he's really missed at this one. The question I want to address tonight is, with Islands, Edges, and Globe, is really a very simple one that I hope will connect with the papers that we've heard today and that will follow in the next 2 days. What is this place, coastal Georgia? Why should we consider it a geographical and historical place of significance quite beyond or appreciation of it, or just that we live here. Now, why this symposium? We know from cultural geographers that the physical characteristics of a place are always interwoven with how people live in it or even visit it, not just shaped or sometimes wrenched into another form as by agriculture or forest exploitation or the manipulation of the place for leisure purposes, causeways, roads, hotels, water parks, but by how people see it, experience it, and the language they use to explain those perceptions and experiences. At the same time, environmental historians have never lost their grasp on the material reality of a place, of how landforms encourage cultural possibilities, or how soils and climate and the flow of water, for example, limit or define the human experiences with that place. There is a there. And even if we are ultimately suspended in a web of our own creations, of our language, limited by our own understandings and how we talk about them, this there can be gotten at least in the outline. We can brush up against it, if not clearly define it. And one of the best ways to do this is to look at a place in the long term, to see what emerges as relative constants in the experience of humans with that place. Excuse me. So what is coastal Georgia? What is, in broad outlines, the environmental history of this place? And why are we here? To think about it in terms of islands, edges, and globe provides us with, I think, windows into the there, or here, but also allows us to think about coastal Georgia in terms of different scales. It allows us to think about the fluid interaction between local, regional, transnational, and global, depending on the question and the time. And this is really an important way to think about environmental history, to think about scale, first of all, and what scale do we need to think in or use to ask the questions that we need to ask in order to solve a problem, historical problem. Coastal Georgia is, first of all, a string of islands. Islands of a particular kind, separated enough from the rest of the coast to be genuine islands, but close enough to share an identity interwoven with the Tidewater coast. Indeed, the Tidewater and coastal plain coast. Indeed, the tides that sweep up and into coastal rivers and define the Tidewater are themselves shaped by these islands. But islands are always different than the main. They are bounded, discrete, easy to mark out, relatively easy to mark out, separate, and not only places that favor retreat and preservation, but have historically been good to dream with and to think with, good to ask questions with. Coastal Georgia and its islands have inspired a lot of island dreams, at the same time that the physical geography of this region has been anchored by islands and their contexts. I think it's important to note that contexts are always a part of it, even when they aren't defined clearly. Though these barrier islands are not the Aegean or Indonesia, they qualify by having a kindred geological history as an archipelago. And I like the original meaning of this. It's a sea marked by islands. Islands and their contexts. Did you know it? This worked when we tried it before the talk. Standing right there. It's not working. Is that it?
Yeah,
Okay.
just
Just need to, okay, I see. All right. Can't just push it at that. Okay, back to islands. The Europeans who began to establish beachheads along the Georgia coast in the 16th century were often inspired by island dreams. And in fact, island dreams were really important to Europeans in general as they moved out and around the globe. always by water. It needs to be underlined. Though the Franciscans who established missions on Georgia's barrier islands appreciated the strategic value of island locations, the insular millenarianism of the Franciscans, an ideology that they hoped would eventually transform not just collected legions of unbaptized souls, but indeed the world, and create a new Christian paradise on earth, was also served well and realized in earthly terms by the island missions on which they hoped to reduce natives to better versions of humans. These missions, beginning with a settlement on St. Augustine in the mid-17th century, collected the natives of Florida and up the coast in what is now Georgia into communities that were themselves islands in the wilderness, with the ultimate intent of not only making good Catholics out of them, but also settling them into established communities supported by agriculture and reducing them into images of the missionaries themselves. And we don't really know very much we don't know anything actually about what Native Americans thought about islands. All we have is this very European fantasy of them crossing over to an island for a picnic. This is one of the earliest images we have of Native Americans in North America. Many of you are perhaps familiar with the images that were done by one of an explorer who accompanied the Carolina expedition, the Fort Carolina colony, and his images were then actually co-authored, were developed by Theodore Debris and published in the late 16th century. There are a series of images. You're probably familiar with them. They show up everywhere. But this is the one that talks specifically about islands. For Robert Montgomery, the Scottish nobleman who in the early 18th century cooked up and promoted the Margravate of Azelia, an overdetermined design for a perfect community, for him, the coastal islands were the Golden Isles. This is where this term originally came from. Lodestars for a perfect community. Montgomery proposed a colony of some 400 square miles along the Savannah River and the Altamaha River in a tract entitled A Discourse Concerning the Designed Establishment of a New Colony to the South of Carolina in the Most Delightful Country of the Universe by Sir Robert Montgomery, Baronet. The tract was a prospectus for the project and also served as an application for a grant of land from the Lords Proprietors of Carolina. And this is a very tidy design of integrated parts that would replicate European social relations and also work perfectly in all kinds of ways. It was a very fanciful but also very clear understanding of how to use the land. I think it's important here, the fanciful part is important to explain what he meant by this or what he thought about this when he created this design. Here's his description of the land that he hoped to build the Margravate on. That nature has not blessed the world with any tract which can be preferable to it. That paradise, with all her virgin beauties, may be modestly supposed at most, but equal to its native excellencies. It lies in the same latitude with Palestine herself, that promised Canaan, which was pointed out by God's own choice to bless the labors of a favorite people. It abounds with rivers, woods, and meadows. Its iron and even gentle hills are full of mines, lead, copper, some of them silver. 'Tis beautiful with odoriferous plants, green all the year, and so on. He goes on at great length about this most delightful country that is going to actually yield itself up to his design with no trouble at all. As it turned out, Montgomery got nowhere with his plan, and it was largely forgotten until historians recovered it in the 19th century and then proclaimed it a curiosity. In the meantime, the British trustees who founded the first colony of Georgia took a larger step onto the mainland, but with an enterprise that was more at the edge of a sea than the edge of a continent, with islands important for strategic purposes as barriers against threats from the Atlantic. But in fact, the Georgia plan itself was an expression of insularism and was rooted in some of the same idealism that had inspired Montgomery's proposal. Much has been written about this, but I think the characterization of colonial schemes in general by historian Daniel Borston about a half century ago is still the best general one. Something about the fabled lushness and tropical wealth of Georgia inspired both extravagance and rigidity in the plans of those who wished to develop it. The supposed prodigality of the land seduced men to believe that they could cut the colony to their own pattern. These early planners combined a haziness about the facts of life in Georgia with a precision in their schemes for that life. I think there was something else in there too, a utopian component, where dreams that in fact required insularity and clearly marked boundaries found a geography that meshed, but that reinforced what one historian has called the romantic insularism of European colonization, and another, a drive for control, a European imperium that was at the core of the process of discovery and colonization. Just a word about this utopian impulse. The original Utopia by Sir Thomas More was a work of literature, not a real community, but it was established on a colony. And in fact, if you look at the history of utopian schemes and utopian novels, a lot of them required islands. They required something that was bounded because of the kind of control that the utopian dreams required in order to make them work. There's a lot of utopian thinking in early schemes for the colonization of North America and certainly in Georgia. The Georgia Plan failed partly because it was an unrealistic imposition on coastal Georgia. The soils and climate quite simply did not turn out to be the blank but prodigiously productive slate that Oglethorpe and the Georgia planners believed it was. In any case, the first years of the colonies were never as substantive as the trustees dreamed they would be. As Paul Presley has pointed out, Georgia in its first 2 decades was not an integrated colony with Savannah as its capital, but a fragile archipelago of 3 small communities, Savannah, Frederica, and Augusta, connected to different parts of the larger Atlantic economy and to different imperial aims. But the islands continued to be attractive to dreamers, and even those who had to tangle regularly with the undreamlike realities of changing weather and difficult soils were encouraged by coastal Georgia geography to social visions that emphasized bounded communities that, if realized, would also step outside of history. Plantations in the antebellum South were in general insular at the same time. Also, plantations in the antebellum South were in general insular, whether they're on islands or in the tidewater or somewhere else, at the same time that they relied upon a larger capitalist economy for their survival. Small dominions for planters, carceral environments for slaves. Sea island cotton planters on the islands and rice planters in the tidewater all sought control and more control over the humans who labored for them, of wind and water and weather, in visions of absolutism on the one hand, or in beneficent patriarchy on the other. Pierce Butler, whose estranged wife, Fanny, all of you are familiar with him, anybody who lives in Savannah anyway, one of the most famous, actually his wife, Fanny Kembler Butler, who the wife for a little while, is better known than he was because of the journal that she kept during her season on a Georgia plantation. Pierce Butler, whose estranged wife, Fanny Kembler Butler, once accused him of wanting to be the emperor of his own domain. This was on Butler's Island in the Altamaha estuary in the 1830s, is a good example of those who had visions of absolutism. William Hazard of St. Simon's Island was a good example of the latter. Hazard wrote in the Southern Agriculturalist in 1828 about his dream of recovering a traditional past on his island plantation, of relative self-sufficiency, affluence, and family, his dream of recovering a dream. Here's what he said: if family and custom and traditions that kept plantation on the islands strong in times past were no longer vital, it was because of prodigality and bad management. It was because our fathers neglected to plant corn, peas, potatoes, and pumpkins. Our forefathers had always raised enough of them on their plantations for all domestic purposes without sacrificing their indigo crops to buy these essentials at an exorbitant price. but they were most needed, as our fathers often did afterwards, when they were most needed, as our fathers often did afterwards, in bartering their cotton for corn. I have it from a planter in Liberty County that $30,000 has been paid out of that county in 1 year for the article of corn alone. What he hoped to recover was something that he believed had happened in the past. It hadn't actually happened, but a kind of self-sufficiency and an autonomy at the same time that he understood, at least indirectly, between the lines in this passage, the extent to which plantations were linked up to a larger world, and especially to markets. Planters growing both crops, and he mentioned indigo. I'm not going to talk about indigo here, but planters growing sea island and cotton sought mastery of the crops by developing systematic methods for growing them. The story of rice planting in the tidewater has been told often enough that I don't need to tell it again here, except to recall that the construction of extensive systems of ditches and drains and canals and dikes and embankments required enormous investments of labor, both to build and to maintain, and an extraordinary level of control. Rice plantations were empires of mud and water, shored up by human hands. Sea island cotton was a more graceful crop, and for a while was the backbone of the low-country plantation belt economy just after the revolution. The filaments of sea island were longer, more elastic, stronger, and silkier than the staple of the green seed short strand cotton, and were much preferred by spinners for the ease with which it could be spun into cotton thread. I want to point out here how important the quality of sea island cotton was to the understanding that planters had of it, and as part of their desire for control over this crop. From the very beginning, planters invested the culture of this high-quality fiber with associations that gave it more than economic value. And sea island cotton plantations marked out distinctive features of the coastal landscape, and especially this island landscape. Expressions of ideal practices. Planters circulated these all the time. They talked about them all the time. They wrote about them in the Southern Agricultural Press, and they circulated memoranda as well on cotton and rice growing and the growing of other crops. And these served as a kind of utopian plan at times for doing agriculture. They were often, planters often did not practice what they preached. They were much better at talking about tidy arrangements for growing crops than they were at actually following through on those practices, partly because they weren't doing any of the work. And a lot of the agricultural knowledge that they were talking about, they had gotten from other places, and especially from the people who were doing the work. In practice, some planters sometimes came close to those ideals. When they didn't, they increasingly told the kinds of stories to each other that created the illusion that they had, especially in regard to rice planting, rice growing. This was a cultural form, in other words, a kind of agricultural utopianism that departed from the actual experience of mucking around in the low-country environment, but that was also deeply rooted in it. And this then was a part of that kind of island understanding, that island ideal that was plantation life in this region. Sea island cotton, like wet culture rice, would grow in a wide range of conditions, did not require as much control as rice agriculture did, but just as production of rice in a specific environment greatly improved yields, so the production of this cotton in a specific locale improved quality. Sea island cotton grew prolifically on sandy pine-barren soils. You don't need sea islands to grow it. Most of Georgia's postbellum crop, produced for a booming market in sewing machine thread, was grown on small farms on the upper coastal plain. The best and silkiest fibers, however, could be produced in environmental conditions found only on the sea islands and a strip of land along the coast, however. There, the moisture-laden sea breezes, what Thomas Spalding on Sapelo Island called an elastic atmosphere, made the staple longer, silkier, and glossier. Planters also credited the saline quality of the air and sometimes of the soil with improving the staple. The best staple was produced on the islands. The best staple on the islands was produced in those fields having an ocean exposure. So it was really an island crop. crop, especially the highest quality, and here the cultural value of the crop, at least until the soils began to decline, and so did the crop, and so did the market in the 1820s. The cultural value of the crop, the reputation of the planter who grew it, was an accomplishment when it was a high when the quality was very high, and in fact this was reflected in the price that the best quality cotton also fetched on the market. Sea Island cotton then was not just a successful commodity crop in a particular island environment, but also became woven into the fabric of island society. Okay, I'm going to change gears here just a little bit and talk about another way that islands have been important to the Georgia coast. Islands have also been retreats, places of restoration, not just little empires, places of restoration, sanctuaries, or sites of discovery and reinvention. Daniel Defoe's marooned Robinson Crusoe was the art's expression of this island experience. Crusoe was the first man, isolated, lonely, but also the namer and remaker of all things on his small domain. Islands are good to dream with, but can also be good to regress into. They can be places where one can return into a prelapsarian innocence, to a time before the fall, to childhood. Never Never Land was an island. I know of no Robinson Crusoe accounts of the Georgia islands, nor for that matter of the Crusoe version for the bourgeoisie, Johann David Wyss's Swiss Family Robinson. But the notion of islands as retreats are part of the long history of the Georgia coast. And we do have a novel by a coastal Georgia author that takes place close enough on an island off the coast of Florida that we might claim it as a Georgia Crusoe novel and appreciate it for what it tells us about this place. And I have not advanced the slides. And in fact, there's a couple of slides in here that I didn't know I had. There you go. Okay. This is F.R. Goulding's Robert and Harold, or The Young Marooners of the Florida Coast. I don't suppose anybody has read this novel or heard about it. Pretty interesting, actually. It's available online. You can download the PDF. It's in the public domain. Published in 1853, and then in many editions afterwards. It was a really popular novel, basically for boys, in the 19th century, in 19th century America. Goulding was born and grew up in Liberty County. And after graduating from the University of Georgia, he was a minister, along with writing novels for boys, in Augusta. Very simply, this novel is about Robert and Harold, and their sister Mary, and their two dogs, Fidel and Mum. Fidel, a bit of a parlor dog, at least at first. The island life toughens her up. And Mum, a dog raised in the Georgia Pine Barrens, exceptionally adept at running deer and other animals, and as Goulding makes clear, no ordinary dog, are marooned on an island after a giant manta ray tows their boat out to sea. Here it is. This is actually, they call it a devilfish. This comes from straight out of just another book. I wonder, maybe some of you may have read this. William Elliott's Carolina Sports by Land and Water, including incidents of devil fishing, wildcats, deer and bear hunting, etc. Published in 1856, but originally published as a series of sketches in a Charleston newspaper. This was something that South Carolina planters actually did. They went out and hunted these. They're depicted as quite gigantic. I don't think we have them around anymore of that size, although I know that people still fish for them because another environmental historian who we all know got his hand all whacked up by one last summer while fishing off Tybee Island. By the time they were able to get free of this devilfish, they were too far out at sea for anyone to find them, and eventually then marooned on an island, which Goulding points out in the preface to a sequel to this novel, is not likely to be found if you go looking for it. Several people apparently had, because of the way that the sinks work in Florida or something like that. It had disappeared. This little group of adolescent marooners created a tent on the island, make a home in a raft, and Mary here is swooned, of course, out of fear, out of being a Southerner, a Southern woman. But she also is able to help them make a home. She toughens up with this experience as well. They discover a wrecked pirate's vessel that supplies them with gunpowder, jerkins of sausage, butter, carpenter's tools, and so on. It's a real haul, and they live off the land with all this stuff to help them out. The boys shoot just about everything that moves, and eat some of it. As well. I mean, one of the things about going back to nature in the American South is that there are usually guns involved. They're almost always, it's like Thoreau with a shotgun or something. It's really, Eastern Oregon, yeah. When they are rescued, their parents are greatly moved by the character they have acquired by their experience in this Edenic island environment. But Gouldy makes it very clear that in the last page especially, that this is exactly what it was, that they regretted leaving. This was a chance for them to return to a childhood before their childhood and gain something from it. He even cites the book of Genesis in his final description of this island as the boys and their sister are leaving. This group of marooners is joined by an African-American boy early in the novel, Sam, depicted as pathetic but a loyal lad and cagily adept at woodcraft in a set of conventions that has deep roots in the American experience with race. In at least one of his other novels for boys, Goulding also adds a Native American as a master of woodcraft. This is even more common. Here, however, African-American boys are showing everyone else something about how to catch rabbits. This is a convention, again, a part of a set of conventions that show up a lot in descriptions of nature in the 18th and 19th century, and 18th and 19th century American in general. Both Native Americans and African Americans were depicted as closer to nature than whites, sometimes quite indistinguishable from animals, in fact, and in possession of superior knowledge of the natural environment at the same time, and especially plants, and especially pharmacopoeia. In fact, you can find some of this in William Bartram, which Etta talked about this afternoon. Bartram's descriptions of the Cherokees is lined up right along with his history, his description of the rest of the natural history of Georgia. And it's good to remember that for a very long time, the remains of Native American culture were housed in the Museum of Natural History. It wasn't until 2004, not in the Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. in the Smithsonian system, and not until 2004 that they were moved from the Museum of Natural History to the new Museum of the American Indian. This was one of the components of racism in colonial America and in the 19th century South. But African Americans had a relationship to natural environments that was often as tangible as these unreflective representations suggested. And they were different kinds of Crusoes, not marooned, but marronage, but taking themselves off to places. They removed themselves, if not to islands, then to isolated or hidden places beyond the bounds of the plantation on which they were enslaved, to run away, to lay out for a while, to worship, and to forage and hunt for the food that sustained both bodies and community. Not a return to childhood, to a prelapsarian past, or to a reinvention of character, but for survival and the creation of community. Cagey about woodcraft, but in a different and far more discreet way than in this and other caricatures of them. There's a lot more that we have to learn about this, I think. After the Civil War, islands for freedmen and women on the Georgia coast were sites where this antebellum experience with retreat was for a very short while rendered visible. "The great cry of our people is for land," said Tunis Campbell, the leader of a social experiment on St. Catherine's Island in 1865. After Sherman captured Savannah in December 1864, he, a couple of months later, issued the field order that appropriated lands along the southeastern coast. And Congress set up the Freedmen's Bureau in March 1865. And at that point, Campbell was appointed to supervise land claims and resettlement on 5 Georgia islands: Ossabaw, Delaware, Colonels, St. Catherine's, and Sapelo. Sherman's order, most of you remember, Sherman's Field Order number 15, appropriated a strip of land from Cape Fear in North Carolina to the St. Johns River, the mouth of St. Johns River in Florida, 30 miles wide off the coast, and made it available to freedmen. A kind of land redistribution plan of the sort that historically has not worked very well in the United States, and indeed it didn't work here very well here either. But for a brief period, a very short season, freedmen built community, grew provisions, and established schools and churches, briefly but in a dramatic expression of yet another, and perhaps one of the most durable, no matter how briefly expressed, of island dreams. Georgia planters who received pardons from U.S. President Andrew Johnson regained control of these islands in 1866. Georgia's coastal islands here became the sites of another kind of retreat, what Campbell called separatism with strength, a vision for black community that was anchored by land ownership, a double islands experience really. The Crusoe and Golding fantasies were projected either onto islands that were unoccupied or, more important, positioned in a world in which Europeans and Americans had hegemony. The short-lived African-American communities on St. Catherine's and Ossabaw Islands were double sanctuaries, autonomous from white control, but also sanctuaries with legal title, with political teeth, at least for a short while, in them. Coastal Georgia was returned to white control by the return of land title to those who had owned the coast before the war, and then these were on the islands replaced by another kind of ownership and island retreat in the next 2 decades. I have big signs in the margin that says slide. Yeah, for me. In the 1880s, the islands were discovered by northern industrialists who used wealth wrested from sources outside the region to establish estates with all the amenities that would give them an insular retreat from the intensifying tumult of industrializing America, a counterpoint to the world that in fact they played a major role in creating. The consequence was the almost absurd arrangement that only an insular geography might make comfortable, of quasi-peasants, the heirs of slavery, clipping the gold greens and shining the shoes of northern industrialists, the heirs of Union victory. The islands became healthful places where townspeople could take the salts, socialize and rest, hunt, fish, dance, bathe, and bicycle, and restore the inner man for life in the town or city. Some tourists also came for the scenery, both natural and historical, to drink in the atmosphere of seashore and old oaks and mosses, or to gaze at the ruins of past landscapes. Excuse me, and I think that visions of nature on the islands have also always had, or not always, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, maybe we'll hear some more about this from Drew Swanson in his paper, have often had, or have had at least in the last century, the ruins of past landscapes as part of the appeal. There have always been ghosts out there. And I think that there's a lot more that we could say about this, but I think that, and I hope we will, I think that how these past landscapes, how history has been frozen in these landscapes and in the appeal that they're meant to evoke, also creates a kind of timelessness. It distorts history at the same time that it also distorts nature. By the 1890s, several of these islands, especially Tybee, St. Simons, and Cumberland, became busy retreats where harried businessmen from Savannah or Brunswick could commute for a day of rest, or middle-class Georgians from Atlanta and Macon could vacation. Now, there's actually write about this in the last chapter of my book. There's a good description there of the language that local editors use to celebrate the islands, the kind of tourist language. Some of this language is still around. But what's important here is that the islands became tourist retreats for some, and they became little empires for others, for northern industrialists who purchased them, especially Sapelo and Cumberland Island and St. Catharines and Ossabaw and Jekyll Island especially. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. About a week ago, I was in Southeast Asia, and I've spent a lot of time in the last 4 days on planes and in hotel rooms, and my voice is going. I really apologize for that, but I will. I think I'll make it through. Climate change as well. Country boys are not made for this. I love to travel, but it's one of the reasons why, one of the tangible ways that I feel a sense of place is that, you know, I don't know if I'm like a good beer or micro beer or wine, but I love to travel, but I don't do it very well. Don't cross time zones very well. I'm always aware there's some kind of, I'm a little bit disoriented all the time whenever I travel a lot. But anyway, I'm going to leave this. I think Buddy Sullivan is going to talk about this topic. There are a lot of things that I'm touching on tonight that we're going to hear a lot more about over the next couple of days, and we're going to have a chance to discuss. But what's important here is that the islands become the kind of tourist retreats, the kind of dreamy tourist retreats, and in very tangible ways that set the mold or set a frame anyway for how they operated, how they worked in the 20th century. Islands have also become attractive to those who would not just imbibe the natural landscapes of the coast, but also study them as relatively bounded sites for the analysis of coastal ecosystems and ecosystem dynamics. Islands in the first place have been crucial to our understanding of evolution and the interaction of biological systems. They have a really powerful role in the history of this science, of these kinds of scientific endeavors. Alfred Wallace, Joseph Hooker, and especially Charles Darwin on the Galapagos in the 19th century created the cornerstone for the modern discipline of ecology by mapping out and analyzing island biogeography. This trend continued throughout the 20th century, came to a culmination of sorts, or at least to a turning point in a dense little volume titled The Theory of Island Biogeography by Robert MacArthur and Edward O. Wilson in 1867. This merged biogeography with the relatively new discipline of ecology in a way that added scientific rigor to both fields. Islands have been especially instructive because of their limited area and their inherent isolation combine to make patterns of evolution stand out starkly. Islands give clarity to patterns of evolution. Generally, you'll find fewer species and therefore fewer relationships among species, as well as more cases of species extinction, but again in stark outline. As science journalist David Quammen explains it, islands have served as the Dick and Jane primers of evolutionary biology, helped scientists master enough vocabulary and grammar to begin to comprehend the more complex prose of the mainlands. More about this in a minute, but even a glance at the history of Georgia's coastal islands in the last half century reveals more scientific research projects than most of us know about. I know I was really surprised last week when I took a quick look at the Eleanor West Ossabaw collection at the list of projects that have been conducted on Ossabaw Island alone. And of course, Sapelo Island has has a relatively permanent, long-lived actually, Sapelo Island research station. It was founded in 1953, continues to do research on the island and especially in estuary ecological systems, and more about that in a minute. In general, coastal Georgia geography reaffirmed the visions and projects that successive generations of missionizers, colonists, creators of plantations and communities, resort impresarios, and scientists have brought to the region. visions of bounded places and bounded experiences that have been reaffirmed by the boundedness of the region's geography. Coastal geography has been a destination for dreams, but has seldom provided a permanent home for it. While island dreams have been rooted in or even extensions of the messy world that they want to escape, the realization of any perfect community also requires the perfectly unreal accomplishment of stepping outside of history. On the Georgia coast, history has often interrupted the hopes of dreamers, but each new tide of change has also brought refreshing possibilities. Okay, that's the biggest of the three islands. What about edges? First of all, the simple fact of ecotones. An ecotone, as I'm sure many of you know, is a transition area between two biomes. It is where two ecological systems meet and integrate. It can be narrow or wide, it can be local or regional, but it is basically the place where two ecological systems come together. When you begin looking for this in the material that we have, take another look at Bartram, for example, you notice a lot of these. This is something that natural historians and then ecologists always notice and talk about. And in practical terms as well, the early records of colonial Georgia are peppered with accounts of turkeys, of wild turkeys. Reverend Martin Johann Bolzius talks about them all the time, the turkeys that he and his Salzburger flock harvested from the field edges that they had created simply by installing in agriculture. And they were common enough that, that they weren't talked about, they weren't described in full, but uncommon enough that they were certainly mentioned. Uncommon because they weighed between 20 and 25 pounds. They were relatively easy to kill. Wild turkeys are a whole lot smarter than their domestic kin, but still relatively easy to kill. And they weighed between 20 and 25 pounds. They yielded between 20 and 25 pounds of meat, rather. More important to the long story of environment and humans on the Georgia coast have been those edges between biological systems that have historically been so productive, driven by and yielding enormous quantities of energy and providing a rich habitat for marine species, especially in estuaries and marshes. And I think that we're going to hear some more about this later this week as well. Eugene Odom, whose understanding of marshland ecology has been so important in our understanding of the energy flow of marsh ecosystems, of the salt marshes, especially in the coast, and also important to our understanding of ecosystem dynamics in general, and also in one of the first really important pieces of legislation protecting a Georgia environment, the Marshland Protection Act of 1970, had a real eye to how these how energy flow in this ecotones operated. And again, I hope we will have a chance to talk about this a little bit more. And another important edge, and one that continues to be really important, was the one between saline and freshwater and how it moved and moves. This is fundamental to any understanding of Georgia environmental dynamics of the islands, the tidewater, estuaries, the intercoastal waterway, and so on. And one of the really important goals of a relatively new Georgia Coastal Ecosystems long-term ecological research program that was established in 2000 was to identify what was happening, what was going to happen in this exchange between freshwater and saltwater. Here's what their website says. The overarching goal of this project, which studies the area mapped out here, you recognize this perhaps as Altamaha, Doughboy, and Sapelo, that area marked out by those places, by the Altamaha River and estuary. Especially, it's meant to include upland barrier islands and marsh hammocks, intertidal areas, as well as submerged river, estuary, and continental shelf habitats. The overarching goal of this project is to understand the mechanisms by which variation in the quality, source, and amount of both fresh and salt water create temporal and spatial variability in estuarine habits and processes. In order to predict directional changes that will occur in response to long-term shifts in estuarine salinity patterns. That's a big goal. But I think it's important that the focal point of this project is to look at that exchange, that very fluid line between saline and fresh water, and study the consequences of this. This was something that was very important. This edge, understanding of this edge, was very important in the early history of the Georgia coast as well. It was a crucial one. Understanding this was a crucial one for the productivity of tidewater rice plantations. When planters, quite likely, with the help of leading slaves, identified the sites for installing rice fields and their infrastructure. Salinity levels in tidewater estuaries markedly affect plant distribution in marshes and swamps along the shores. And I have a pretty full description of this in Nature Suffers. But this vegetation was read by whoever was reading it to identify the best place to site a rice plantation using the tidal method for draining and flooding fields. The stakes were very high. It's important to remember this. Getting it right was really important. Understanding it was really important because of the enormous investments of labor that then were required to make a plantation. An 8 square mile plantation, when it was completely improved, had 2¼ miles of exterior, interior, and check banks, and 12 or 13 miles of canals, ditches, and quarter drains. In other words, slaves working with hand tools had to move well over 39,000 cubic yards of fine-grained river swamp muck to construct an 80-acre plantation, in addition to clearing the land and leveling the ground in the fields. Finding the right pitch far enough upstream to avoid saline intrusions, but low enough to tap into tidal action to flood and drain the fields required high-stakes reading of the complex edge between fresh water and salt. Another important edge was the edge that the colonies occupied, the Georgia colonies occupied, and then the state of Georgia occupied on the edge of a larger economy, on the edge of an Atlantic highway for goods and bodies, when it was on an important periphery of an economy that was Atlantic-wide. Both islands and edges were necessary in this. Daniel Defoe declared about England's dependence upon its sugar islands in 1713, no sugar, no islands. No islands, no continent. No continent, no trade. And as many scholars have pointed out, most recently Philip Morgan, Georgia at first was one of those islands, linked more to the British West Indies than to other parts of North America. This geography shifted only slowly. The Atlantic connections continued to be crucial in the flow of environmental energy from the coast throughout the antebellum period. Markets for rice, and especially sea island cotton, existed almost entirely out of coastal ports, with Savannah as the hub. The balance shifted substantially only after the Civil War, as the tidewater became a backwater, as rice plantations were gradually mostly abandoned, at least for the production of rice, and sea islands became colonies of leisure for ludicrously wealthy northern industrialists. Though not entirely, the longleaf pine of the coastal plain exited Georgia mainly through coastal ports, the harvesting of which created a new edge as Piedmont cotton agriculture moved into the deforested coastal plain. And Darien, for a while, became an international timber entrepot of lumber milled from yellow pine, rafted down the Altamaha, and then transported by sea out to the world. This was over actually quite quickly. The technologies kept getting better and better. It didn't take long for the coastal plain to be logged, and then timber industrialists moved to the Pacific Northwest and pretty much finished off the continent at that point. The most prominent current edge is one that links coastal Georgia to the globe. As a matter of what will happen, perhaps is already happening to coastal Georgia because of climate change. An increase in the movement of sand along the seaward side of the sea islands, new kinds of erosion problems, Estuaries all over the world are vulnerable to the sea island rise that global warming will continue to cause, including those on the Georgia coast. Coastal Georgia will have increased vulnerability to the kind of storms that rice planters worried so much about, the convergence of a high tide and fall storms off the Atlantic, but now joined by higher sea levels as well. Paul asked me to talk about what had changed since Nature Suffers was published. I was swamped by this prospect when I first began surveying the scholarship that has been published in the subsequent 20 years, and it's getting a lot better, marked especially by an important and increased attention to African American history and Paul's and Etta Fields Black's efforts to link coastal Georgia to an Atlantic world and to other continents. Other than that, I see one major change. And that is the end of nature. Sound a little bit like, maybe not, Larry David's impression of Bernie Sanders on Saturday Night Live. We are doomed! And in fact, that's kind of where I'm going. It's a terrible thing to do. This is going on too long. I'm making you sit here for a long time, and then I'm telling you that the end is near. We will really have to go out and have something to drink when this is done. Bill Mckibben's 1989 book, which was the first account of global warming for the general reader, and expressed a set of ideas that began to gain traction in the 1990s in tandem with the growing awareness of the environmental challenges of global warming, inspired this notion, this idea. The argument really, Mckibben's argument was really very simple, that evidence of anthropomorphic change of the upper atmosphere with a change in climate as a consequence meant that no part of Earth remained untouched by human action and influence. The environment we live in is a human-shaped one, entirely. There's no culture in nature. It's entirely a human-shaped one. The end of nature. With two main consequences: a shift in the scale at which environmental stories were conceived by historians. There were other reasons, there have been other reasons for this in the last 20 years, but one of these has been an awareness of the environmental problem, the main environmental problem of our time, which will have specific local manifestations, but is a global phenomenon. Also, the questioning of ideas of the pristine, of the wild. This has converged with the scholarship questioning 20th century American ideas about the wild in general, about wilderness, about the divide between culture and nature. And this is kind of a topic for another discussion altogether. But if there is no nature, if there is no part of Earth that has not been shaped by human action in one way or another, making a distinction between culture and nature, between the unwild, the domestic, and the wild is a somewhat arbitrary one now. One of the ways that environmental historians have conceptualized the end of nature is by appropriating the concept of the Anthropocene from its yet uncertain scientific context and using this to explain our modern relationship with nature. The Anthropocene is a proposed geological epoch. Hasn't yet been accepted by the International Commission on Stratigraphy nor the International Union of Geological Sciences. Apparently these guys have to accept this concept in order for it to become official. But it's been appropriated. It's a proposed epoch that begins when human activities started to have a significant global impact on Earth's geology and ecosystems. But it's been appropriated by historians and cultural studies folks and a lot of other people to talk about what has happened to what we used to call nature in modern times, in the 21st century especially. Some celebrate a full embrace of the Anthropocene as a kind of neoliberal, neo-capitalist ecstasy that spurns conservation efforts and jettisons the idea of wilderness, and that, of course, also assumes that we can manage environments as adeptly as we've exploited them. Others among the more conservation-minded resign themselves to the Anthropocene in the strategic hope that this is the best way forward for whatever little gains might be made in such a context. Others still reject the new framing entirely and hold out for what they take to be more genuine or authentic ways of encountering what might remain of nature. And I would add that others yet see it as a necessary and somewhat clunky concept that nonetheless in shorthand reminds us that we are now on a different planet, or on another island, if you will, and it doesn't look good. Okay, I could end here. I have a couple of alternate endings, but the only other thing that I'd really like to point out is that Georgia, the coastal Georgia really is a special place. And there's some ideas about the Sea Islands especially, but of the sanctity of nature along at least the rim, along the edge of coastal Georgia, that constitute a powerful imaginary, and it's not going to disappear. It has stoked some important environmental protection initiatives, and especially now in counterpoint to what's happened on the rest of the coastal plain, which has now been thoroughly transformed by the forest products industry and by a couple of military bases. It's not going to go away, and I suspect that current notions of that the abundant coast and the Golden Isles will not acquire any more stability in the future than they have in the past. That they are part, but they are part of the identity of this place, and we may need them as long as we know that when we dream too forcefully about islands or structure too forcefully the streams of energy that move around them, we're going to be disappointed. And I tried to get them to scan this at the hotel. I picked this up at the airport last night. This is the most recent island dream. This is the Golden Isles official visitor guide. And this is a little bit different from the other one I have in my file from 1995, which has a sunset down over the marshes. This is someone in a hammock out on the beach, presumably reading the book that is going to come out of this symposium. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Hope so.
Over here. Yes, sir.
I think it's a big claim to make that there was a utopian impulse in early colonial schemes, but I don't think it's an incorrect one. Yeah.
Question right out here. Yes, sir.
Rebuilding shorelines?
Fortifying shorelines.
What does that mean, fortifying shorelines? Restoration? Beach renourishment. Well, we have problems with that. I live on the Strait of Georgia, or close to it anyway. We have problems with that in places along the coast. Actually, kind of a similar environment in some ways. Vancouver Island protects the coast north and south of Bellingham from some of the worst incursions of the Pacific. And I don't really know, I'm stalling a little bit here, because I don't really have an answer to that. What do I think about it? I don't, I'm not opposed to re-engineering nature. And I think that there is a kind of conservation, there are some fields of ecology. Ecology now is a very pluralistic discipline, but some fields of ecology that seek a good deal more stability than others do. And I see some of that in conservation biology, but in other attempts to restore habitats, for example. I mean, there's some canebrake renovation programs in, I think, Mississippi and Tennessee in order to, with the hope of restoring habitat for songbirds, certain kinds of songbirds. And I think that it's sometimes a kind of endeavor that runs against the tide, so to speak. But yeah, I'm not an expert in that, in beach renourishment or in restoration ecology. So I can't really make a claim about it, but maybe.
I was going to say, or I don't know about my question, but there was a movie they showed recently here in Savannah for the Ocean Film Fest called, or maybe it was the Telluride Film Fest, I can't keep them straight, but Racing Extinction, and it showed all these, things getting wiped out, and trash and plastic bottles and all sorts of things around the world. We've, wiped out 80+% of the large fishes in the ocean. And it was easy to get down, but they had a quote from Jane Goodall, who's a woman who studied apes in Africa, and she said, there's a lot going on, but there's still a hell of a lot worth saving. And I think that Georgia coast and our islands that we have here on the coast, a lot of which are not developed and don't have bridges to them and don't have million people on them, it is worth saving. And I think you pointed that out and done a good job with it. But I think we'll also be on the front lines of sea level rise potentially into the future here. And that's definitely an Anthropocene effect. And we're obviously in some sort of an Anthropocene age, whether they affect it or not. But what do you think about sea level rise and other changes to the Georgia coast in the next 50 or 100 years?
Let me back up just a little bit. I do want to say that I think, yeah, worth saving. And I think that this argument about whether pristine and notions of wilderness are only a cultural construct and sometimes kind of a pernicious one, we should not be allowed to be led astray by those. And I remember Gary Snyder, the poet, Gary Snyder, pioneering environmentalist whose book of poetry, Turtle Island, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1970. His response to this argument about wilderness in the 1990s, he finally said, okay, relatively pristine. Who cares? They're still important. Wilderness areas are still really important preserves of biodiversity, and we need them. And that's kind of my response to this as well, ultimately, that we need to talk about, especially when we look at how pristine on Georgia Islands has gotten caught up in ways to freeze history and to freeze, in fact, 19th century notions of social relations sometimes in the way that the ruins that are a part of those and the ghosts that are a part of those are also depicted. I think that really needs to be interrogated, but it doesn't mean that we should reject these places as important preserves of biodiversity. We shouldn't try to keep them that way. Now, as far as the effects of sea level change on the Georgia coast, I don't know very much about that. And to tell you the truth, my own focus or my own thinking about this has been on another estuary. Estuaries all over the world are going to be endangered by sea level change, and in ways that I don't think we've really thought through very much. A lot of my work in the recent past has been in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, and there, the 25 million people live in what is also essentially the rice bowl of Vietnam. Right? Vietnam is the second largest rice exporter in the world, and a lot of this area, most of it actually, is only 1 to 3 meters above sea level, and it's already being threatened by sea level increases. And the stakes are very, very high there. And they're already having to find ways to adapt to that. The really interesting array of strategies that involve people. And I think that this is really one of the key features, that needs to be one of the key features of our response to this environmental issue. It kind of go back to William Bartram, go back to that 18th century natural history. We see some of this in what we call adaptive management that Nancy Langston has described so eloquently in her study of the Malheur bird refuge in Oregon, which has been in the news a lot lately because of the loonies, the right-wing loonies who occupied it. I'm using my friend Ursula Le Guin's language there. That a kind of management process that that takes into account the people who live in the place, and that takes into account changes that are happening, where you have a management strategy that has talking points rather than a code that is then applied, or a scientific plan that is applied by experts. But one that has talking points that are negotiated by all the stakeholders and worked out in a very fluid process that takes into account changes as they're happening. You know, one of the really nice things about the Georgia coast is you've got an extraordinary scientific monitoring of all kinds of things on the Georgia coast that, you know, it's one of the things that attracted me to studying this area in the first place, in fact, was the amount of scientific study that's done. So you've got really good information from that sector, but this needs to be worked out in a kind of ongoing negotiation. That's my response to your question. I don't know specifically what needs to be done to protect estuary ecosystems, environments, for example, against climate change. Some of the worst effects that might occur because of sea level increase on estuaries will be buffered by the barrier islands too. You know, it's a mixed blessing.